In this video, you're going to explore two more ways to use promises. We'll create functions that take input and return a promise, and we'll explore promise chaining, which is going to let you combine multiple promises. Now, the problem with our example is that we have this promise, but it doesn't take any input. And that's most likely never going to be the case when we're using real-world promises. We're going to want to provide some input, like the ID of a user to fetch from the database, a URL to request, or a partial URL, for example, just the address component. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to create a function. For this example, we're going to make a variable, which will be a function, called async add. It's going to be a function that simulates async functionality using setTimeout, and in reality, it's just going to add two numbers together. But it is going to illustrate exactly what we need to do later in this section to get our weather app using promises. Now, in here, we are going to take two arguments, A and B, and what we're going to do is return a promise. So whoever calls this method, async add, they can pass in input, but they can also get the promise back, so they can use then to sync up and wait for it to complete. Right here, we're going to use return to do just that. We're going to return a new promise using the exact same new promise syntax we did when we created a promise down below. Now, this is the same exact function, so we do need to provide that constructor function that gets called with both resolve and with reject, just like this. Perfect. Now we have an async add function. It takes two numbers and it returns a promise. The only thing left to do inside of here is actually simulate that delay and make the call to resolve. Right here, I'm going to simulate that delay using setTimeout. Then I'm going to go ahead and pass in my callback function, setting the delay to 1.5 seconds or 1,500 milliseconds. In here, all I'm going to do is write a simple if-else statement that's going to check if the type of both of these is a number. If it is, great. We'll resolve the value of the two numbers added. If they're not numbers, one or more, then we're going to go ahead and reject. To do that, we'll use an if statement with the type of operator. If type of A is equal to number. Here we're using type of to get the string type for the variable, and we're checking if it's equal to a number, which is what's going to come back from type of when we have a number. Now, if the type of A is a number and, using double ands, the type of B is also a number, then we're good to go. We can go ahead and add the two up, resolving the value. Inside of the code block of the if statement, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to call resolve, passing in A plus B. Perfect. This is going to add the two numbers up, passing in one argument to resolve. Now, this is the happy path when both A and B are indeed numbers. If things don't go well, we're going to want to go ahead and reject. I'm going to use else to do that. If this condition fails, we're going to go ahead and reject by calling reject. Arguments must be numbers. Awesome. Now we have an async add function that takes two variables, A and B, returns a promise, and anyone who happens to call async add can add a then call onto the return result to get that value. Now, what exactly is this going to look like? To show you, I want to comment out all of the code we have below, and just below where we make async add, I'm going to go ahead and actually call it. We're going to call it like we would any other function, async add, passing in two values. Remember, this could be a database ID or anything else for an async function. In our case, it's just two numbers. I'm going to go with 5, and I'll go with 7. Now, the return value from this function, it is a promise. We could make a variable and call then on that variable, but we could also just tack then on right here. And that's exactly what we're going to do when we use promises. We're going to tack on then, passing in our callbacks. The first one being the success case and the second one being the error case. Here, we're going to get our error message, which we can log to the screen using console.log. Console.log, error message. If one or more of the numbers are not actually numbers, the error function is going to fire because we called reject. If both are numbers, all we're going to do is get the result and print it to the screen. Console.log, I'll print the string result with a colon. Then as the second argument, I'll pass in that actual number, which is going to print it to the screen as well. Now that we have our promise async add function in place, let's go ahead and test this out over inside of the terminal. I'm going to run nodemon to start up the app. Nodemon playground/promise.js. Perfect. Now, right away, we do get that delay, and the result 12 prints to the screen. And this is fantastic. We were able to create that function that takes that dynamic input, but still returns a promise. Now, notice we've taken an async function that usually requires callbacks, and we've wrapped it to use promises. This is a really, really handy feature. As you start using promises in Node, you're going to come to realize that some things do not support promises, and you'd like them to. For example, that request library we use to make our HTTP requests, that does not support promises natively. But you can wrap your request call inside of a promise, which is what we're going to do later in the video. For now, though, we have a basic example illustrating how this works. Now, what I'd like to do is talk about promise chaining. This is the idea of having multiple promises run in a sequence. For example, I want to take an address and convert that into coordinates, and take those coordinates and convert them into weather information. That is an example of needing to synchronize two things, and we can do that really easily using promise chaining. In order to chain your promises, what you're going to do inside of your success call is return a new promise. In our example, we can return a new promise by calling async add again. I'm going to call async add right here, passing in two arguments: the result, whatever the previous promise returned, and some sort of new number. Let's go ahead and use 33. Now what I'm doing is returning a promise so I can add my chaining onto it by calling then again. Then is going to get called after we close the closing parentheses for our previous then. We're going to tack it on right here. And this is also going to take one or more arguments. We can pass in a success handler, which is going to be a function, and an error handler, which will also be a function. Perfect. And now that we have our then callbacks set up, we can go ahead and actually fill them out. Once again, we are going to get a result here. This is going to be the result of 5 plus 7, which is 12, plus 33, which is going to be 45. Right here, we can print console.log should be 45. Then we're going to go ahead and print the actual value from the results variable. Now our error handler is also going to be the same. Right here, I'm going to have my error message, and I'm going to print it to the screen using console.log, printing error message. And now what we have is some chaining. These functions are going to fire based off the result of our first async add. If it goes well, the first one will fire. If it goes poorly, the second function is going to fire. Our second then call is going to be based off of the async add call where we add 33. This is going to let us chain the two results together, and we should get 45 printing to the screen. I'm going to go ahead and save this file, which is going to restart things over inside of nodemon, and eventually we're going to get our two results, the 12 and our should be 45. Right here, we get just that. Result 12 and should be 45 printing to the screen. Now, when it comes to error handling, there are a few quirks, so what I want to go ahead and do is simulate some errors. First up, let's go ahead and simulate an error right here with our second async add call, and we know we can do that by passing in a value that's not a number. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and wrap 33 inside of quotes. This is going to be a string, and our call should reject. Now I can go ahead and save the file, and we can see what happens. Things restart. We get our result 12, and then we get our error arguments must be numbers, exactly as we expect. This is printing right here. Now this case works just as expected. Instead of getting should be 45, we get our error message. But things get a little trickier when something earlier on in the promise chain gets rejected. Let's go ahead and swap 33 out for the number 33. Then up here, we're going to replace 7 with the string 7. This is going to cause our first promise to fail, which means we'll never see the result. We should see the error message printing to the screen, but that's not what's going to happen. When I restart, we do indeed get the error message printing to the screen, but then we get should be 45 is undefined. This console.log is running because the promise chain thinks we've cleaned up the error because we provided an error handler right here. It's running the error handler. Then it says, okay, things must be good now. We ran the error handler. Let's go ahead and move on to the next then call, calling the success case. To fix this, what we can do is actually remove both of our error handlers from both then calls and replace them with a call at the very bottom to a different method. What we're going to do down here is call .catch. The catch promise method is similar to then, but it just takes one function, and this is the error handler. Right here, we can specify one error handler if any of our promise calls fail. We're going to take that error message and we're going to print it to the screen using console.log error message. Now, I know promises can be pretty confusing at first, especially when it comes to promise chaining. I promise, though, no pun intended, we are going to be using this throughout the course, and things will be a lot clearer as we start working with real-world examples. For now, though, if things are a little blurry, that is okay. As long as you're starting to see exactly what we're doing. We're taking the result from one promise and we're passing it to a different one. In this case, the result works exactly as expected. The first promise fails, we get arguments must be numbers printing to the screen, and we don't get that broken statement where we try to print 45, but we get undefined instead. Using catch, we can specify an error handler that's going to fire for all of our previous failures, and this is exactly what we want. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some libraries support promises and others don't. The request library does not. Your challenge for this video is going to be to make a function that wraps request returning a promise. I'll give you a quick setup, and then you're going to be responsible for actually filling it out. In the playground folder, we can make a new file to store this called promise2, promise-2.js. And what we're going to do is make a function called geocode address. The geocode address function is going to take the plain text address, and it's going to return a promise. You'll be responsible for writing that code in just a second. I will show you how I'd like it to run by calling it down below. Geocode address is going to return a promise, so if I pass in a zip code like 19146, I would expect a promise to come back that I can attach a then call to. This is going to let me wait for that request to finish. Right here, I'm going to tack on a call to then, passing in my two functions, the success handler for when the promise is fulfilled, and the error handler for when the promise is rejected. Now, when things go well, I'm going to expect that location object with the address, the latitude, and the longitude, and when things go poorly, I'm going to expect that error message. When the error message happens, we'll just print it to the screen using console.log error message. And for now, when things go well and the success case runs, we're just going to print that entire object using our pretty printing technique. Console.log, then we'll call json.stringify like we've done many times before, passing in the three arguments, the object, undefined for the filter method, which we're never going to use in the course, and the number 2 for the number of spaces we'd like to use as our indentation. This is what I want you to create, the function that lets this functionality work as expected. This then call should work as typed here. Now, I'll give you a few hints on how I want you to do this. The first thing you're going to need to do is load in request in this file since it's not here. Then you're going to copy the geocode.js code from here. Take everything from the variable declaration all the way down through the closing of the request callback parentheses. Now, inside of here, you are going to have to make a few changes. You're still going to get the address. We specified that right here. But you're no longer going to get that callback. Instead, what you're going to have is the promises resolve and reject functionality. That means instead of calling the callback with one argument to trigger an error, you'll call reject. And instead of calling it with that second argument for the success case, you're going to call resolve. Now, this also means that the request code needs to get put inside of the promise constructor function, kind of like we have here. Right here is where you're going to want to put request, inside of the promise you're returning. Now, I know this is a little open-ended, and I know it's a little difficult considering we just got started with promises, but they are a really important topic, and I want to give you experience upfront playing around with them. So go ahead and try to knock this out. If you don't get it on your first try, no problem. As long as you gave it an honest shot and you tried something out, then that is considered a success. You can always ask me in the QA area if you got stuck on this one. Take a moment to pause the video, knock this out, run the code from the terminal exactly as I have here, and when you're done, click play. How'd you do? Hopefully you were able to add that call to request inside of geocode address, and you wrapped it in a promise so the code down below worked. To get started, I'm going to go ahead and return that promise by calling return new promise, passing in my constructor function. Inside of here is where I'm going to add that call to request. Let's go ahead and add on some missing semicolons, and then we can provide the arguments, resolve and reject. Now that we have our promise set up, we can go ahead and load in the request module up top, creating a constant called request, and setting that equal to the return result from require request. Next up in our list of things to do is going to be to move into the geocode.js file, grab everything inside of the function, and move it over into the promise2 file, right here inside of the constructor. Now from here, we are mostly good to go. We really only need to change a few things. The first thing we need to do is replace our error handlers. Right here, we call our callback handler with one argument. Instead, what we're going to do is call reject, because if this code runs, we want to reject the promise. We have the same thing right here. We're going to call reject. If we get 0 results, that is indeed a failure, and we do not want to pretend we succeeded. Now down below, this is where things did go well. What we can do here is call resolve. And we can also remove that first argument, since as we know, resolve and reject, they only take one argument. We are able to specify multiple values though, because we do resolve an object with properties on it. Now that we have this in place, we are done. We can actually go ahead and save our file, rerun it over inside of the terminal, and test things out. I'm going to save the file, move into the terminal, and shut down nodemon for the promise.js file, and I'm going to run node for the promise2 file. It's in that playground folder, and it's called promise-2.js. Now, when I run this program, we're actually making that HTTP request, and right here you can see the data comes back exactly as we expected. We get our address, we get our latitude, and we get our longitude. This is fantastic. Now, before we stop, I do want to test out what happens when I pass in an invalid address, something like 5 zeros, which we've used before to simulate an error. I'm going to save the file, rerun the program, and right here, unable to find that address prints to the screen. And this only happens because we call reject. We call reject inside of the promise constructor function. Down below, we have our error handler, which prints the message to the screen. This is an example of how to take a library that does not support promises and wrap it in a promise, creating a promise-ready function. In our case, that function is geocode address. Now, in the next video, we're going to take a look at a library similar to request called Axios that actually does support promises. So there's no need to wrap our function calls inside of a promise. This is going to let us simplify our code, creating our promise calls really, really easily. We're going to actually rebuild the entire weather app in the next video. So stay tuned. I will see you then.